Good evening, everyone. The time is 12 minutes to 8. We're going to go live at exactly 8 o'clock. And we want to welcome everyone this evening who's joining us from around South Africa and around the globe. I see we've got lots of people watching. It's wonderful to have the Kaplans back. I see they've joined us from Toronto. So please, if you're with us, let us know in the chat either on Zoom or on YouTube. We'd love to know where in the world you are at the moment. And we'd love to send you, in fact, Chanukah greetings. Sean, where in the world are you?
Howie, I'm in Plettenberg Bay.
And is it sunset already in Plet?
It is, actually. It is.
Have you lit in your Chanukah candles?
No, not yet, not quite. And I'm waiting for Choni to do that. I'm super excited for that.
I was a little ahead of the time. You can see behind me. I'm trying not to burn down my study, but you'll see my Chanukah candles behind me. So tell me, are you one that takes your shamash and extinguishes it, or are you, or do you let it burn out?
I let it burn out, Howie.
So when it comes, and luckily Rabbi Zarum has joined us now, so he can give us a halakhic opinion. Not that I don't trust your halakha, Sean. So if we allow our shamash to burn out on Chanukah, then Rafi, what happens on Pesach when we're looking for our chometz? Aren't we supposed to be wandering around with our shamash at that point in time?
Left over, you mean?
Yes.
It might have gone out before it was finished. It's just a minhag.
So what's the minhag in the Zarum family?
Pardon?
What's the minhag in your family? Do you let your shamash burn out? But you set the entire house on fire.
We actually have a flower box. Flowers don't grow in England because of the rain, so you have a special glass box, and we use that to put the Chanukah outside of our house on the windowsill, so neighbours can pass by and see it. And there's a Christmas tree next door, so it's very cool.
Are you on lockdown in the UK? Are people allowed to walk past your home?
They're allowed to walk. They're not allowed to come inside or gather in more than 6.
Or come into your garden?
Or come. No, you're allowed in the garden. Now you're allowed in the garden. Yes, up to 6.
Fantastic. I see Teddy has joined us from Sydney. Now, I imagine it's the middle of the night in Sydney. Teddy, what time is it on your side? And I see Gavin Meltz is in Chelterdale. Welcome, Gavin. Great to see you again. Sean, it does feel like an awful long time since we did one of these webinars because we've had Jewish Achiever Awards interrupting us in the middle.
Yes, but Howie, you did such a spectacular job on Achievers. I don't think we missed the beat.
So, well, we had quite an audience for Achievers. We may have had over 50,000 people watching us. I hope your guests this evening are in fact going to be in that league and bring in another 50,000 people to watch tonight.
Yes, I don't think it will be a problem, Howie.
I see Linda has joined us from San Diego. Fantastic, Linda. Wonderful to see people coming in from around the world. And Choni G, why don't we turn on your camera? And Gila, let's turn on your camera as well. Hello, Choni.
Hey.
You were the star of Jewish Achiever Awards. People loved your duo with Bibi, and people absolutely loved your rendition of Shout. Did you get much feedback?
Lots of feedback. I'm just testing the volume here. Yeah, no, it was amazing. It was a beautiful experience, and we got a lot of feedback. It was great, very positive. I know you got a lot of feedback as well.
We got an amazing amount of feedback, and people absolutely loved your 2 numbers that you did on the show that night. So tell us, who is with you behind you with the guitar?
Rob Jeffrey.
Hi, everyone.
He's in my social circle, so it's all good.
Okay, that's fantastic, and we trusted. He looks like it's not the first time he's picked up a guitar this year.
Yeah, it's the first time he's picked up the guitar for Chanukah. But do you think we should bring the menorah a bit closer, or it's good there?
Well, look, I don't want to set your hair on fire.
House on fire. Yeah. No. Okay. I mean, we can bring it a bit closer, but then I'm just gonna look the other way from the screen wise. But okay, it's all right.
While you light it, but we sure when you sing you'll be looking at us.
Should we do sound check for everybody who's joined us?
Let's in fact do a quick sound check, and we want to say hello to Gila as well. Gila, I know your microphone is on, but we can't see you, so I trust your camera is working.
I think she'll come in soon.
Yeah, she might only join a bit later, Howie. She might have just logged in now.
Okay, and which...
We've just begun Chanukah in England. It's 5 to 6 here. There's Chanukah candles burning everywhere. I'm going to go home after this to light.
Da 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 da. Ti da da la 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 la. Da 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 da. You can hear me, right?
We can definitely hear you.
Ti da 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 da.
So, Choni, are there words to that song, or will you just be doing that?
Yeah, I'll just be doing that. I think everybody else can sing the words. I don't
No
know the
one
words.
really knows all the words. They just know the first line, and after that, they do something similar.
Thankfully, I brought a sitter with me, so I should be good. I'll be doing
now,
the words. This is just the sound check. Sound check.
Okay.
I don't do words.
Okay, and news is now out. Your father is going to retire. That's a great institution.
He's
not
just
retiring.
passing on the baton.
Ah, okay. So that's big news for South African Jewry. He's been a staple of South African Jewry and one of the most prominent rabbis in our community for many, many decades.
Ah, please God. I grew up. I was 3 years old when he joined Sydenham, and it is big news. But please God, he'll stay on. He'll stay on in the shul, and he wants to be able to write and speak. And I actually just see his book here. He wants to write another book, and I see Rabbi Jonathan Sacks wrote a testimonial for his book.
Oh wow! So there are in fact many connections between yourself, your family, and Jonathan Sacks, and you're going to tell us some of those when you sing this evening.
Yeah, I'll share one anecdote later on.
Fantastic. Daniel Taub, welcome to you.
Hello, wonderful to be here. Can I just ask you to check the sound? I'm away from my house, and there's a little bit of background noise which I hope you're not picking up on. Does it sound okay to you?
It sounds okay. You could be slightly louder, but the one thing I would love to change is we getting flare from the lights behind you.
Let me see if I can do something about that. Just one
okay.
moment.
You could even move the camera just slightly, and I think that would help.
Let's try this. Is that better?
That's much better.
Okay, that's great. Hi, Rafi. Wonderful to see you.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Chagurim Sameach.
So, Daniel, where in the world are you?
So I'm in Israel. I'm actually in Netanya at the moment. We have gone away, our family, our kids, our grandkids. We've just taken a couple of days away. And I told them before that we went away, I've got this little slot that I was already earmarked. I just want you to make sure that we have a little bit of quiet. I can't guarantee 100% quiet with the grandkids, but we're doing the best that we can.
So, of course, you were Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom.
That's correct.
Today, there is some very major diplomatic news that's broken.
That's exactly right. Another peace agreement. I have to say, I feel a bit frustrated. I worked for 20 years in peace negotiations. And, I spent all of my time negotiating with Palestinians and with Syrians. They made peace with Jordan without me. They made peace with Egypt without me. Now they're doing Bahrain, Emirates, Morocco. It's becoming quite clear that I'm the problem here. It's not.
So how significant is it for Israel to have now normalized relations with Morocco?
So actually, a lot of these peace agreements that we're seeing recently in Morocco is definitely one of them. the difference is not in terms of the quality of the relations that were basically there beforehand. Really, we're just talking about a situation where what was going on under the table is now allowed to go on top of the table. It's very similar to really what was happening in Jordan. You know, many years ago, Jordan was actually the first country that Israel made peace with. We just didn't sign an agreement with them. But then what happened was we became able. I think if you look at these things more broadly, it's first of all changing a regional dynamic, and we have Iran to thank for that. And if you think about the Palestinian issue, which in Europe and in the West people are most concerned about, it's changing the size of the issue, I think, by and large. It's making it seem like a much more contained, localized issue rather than something that the entire Arab world rallies around. So it's good news. There's no doubt about it. You know, it's significant.
And of course, there's a very significant Moroccan Jewish community living in Israel with deep roots and many, many centuries of deep roots within Morocco. Do you think many people are going to go back and visit family and go find their roots now?
The fact is, for quite a long time, Morocco has already been a fairly popular destination amongst Israelis, and not just amongst people with Moroccan family backgrounds. It's got an amazing Jewish heritage. It's really fascinating to visit. So even before this agreement, in that sense, the Moroccan agreement is a little bit less significant than, for example, Dubai or Bahrain, which were countries that very few Israelis were actually going to, or if they were going, they were not going on Israeli passports. Israelis for at least a decade now, probably more, have been going on sort of Jewish study tours of Morocco, exotic trips, and so on and so forth.
I don't know if you follow South African-Israel relations, but when in fact Israel normalized relations with UAE, our government expressed deep regret over it.
Really?
Yes.
And the regret was because the Palestinians were being sidelined, or
there should be no normalization without Palestinians. When Bahrain signed the deal, they were more silent. When Sudan did it, even more silence. With Morocco now, it seems to be a little bit of an avalanche, but our government appears to be very out of step with what's happening in the Arab world, and certainly what's happening in parts of Africa and the Middle East.
So again, I mean, the question is, what does support for the Palestinians mean? Does it mean sticking by a sort of a very transient sort of boycott type mentality of their leadership? Or does it mean trying to do things that actually support the people who are, building new opportunity and so on? So obviously the position of the South African government is very well known, but it's unfortunate. The fact is, it's get with the people who are looking to the future, and that's a message for even within the Palestinian community. There are entrepreneurs, there are tech people and so on and so forth who are doing joint ventures with Israelis. And that's really where the future is, and the politicians need to catch up with them.
Well, we're going to start our webinar now. Unfortunately, we didn't have time because I wanted to speak about Hanan Ashrawi, in fact, resigning her position this week as well. But maybe we'll get a chance to speak about that a little later on in our show this evening. But to everyone around the world, a huge welcome. Sean, you've put in an enormous amount of effort this evening to gather some of the greatest Jewish intellectuals and thought leaders from around the world to speak about Jonathan Sacks, not the man, because so many people have spoken about Jonathan Sacks, the man, but not so many people are talking about the enduring ideas and the legacy of philosophy and thought that he's left us with.
Yes, absolutely, Howie. So we're extremely excited and we're extremely grateful to start out with Rafi and Daniel for joining us. And I think, from our perspective at the Jewish Report and on behalf of the South African community, we thought, how do we pay tribute in a unique way to Rabbi Sacks and his legacy? And I think our contribution to that is to talk about his ideas and talk about and make sure those ideas live on in a very enduring way.
Well, on behalf of the South African Jewish Report, I want to welcome you to our 66th webinar since lockdown has begun. We did a calculation the other day and we realized that we have now been watched more than 700,000 times since the beginning of lockdown.
Right.
And it's really quite astounding when you think about the breadth that we've reached. Jewish Achiever Awards, which we had last weekend, which was watched by over 50,000 people around the world. And I went on to some of the stats to have a look where people joined us from. And we had viewers in places like Brazil and Peru and Costa Rica, United States, Canada, all over Europe, parts of Africa. It's just amazing how the reach of the Jewish Report has really resonated with people, and people have bought in really to the most engaging discussions you can have. So on behalf of the South African Jewish Report, a big welcome this evening. We're so delighted to have you. If you haven't told us where in the world you're watching from this evening, please use the chat functionality that you'll see on Zoom, or if you're watching on YouTube, please use the chat functionality on YouTube and tell us exactly where in the world you are. Also, please don't forget at the bottom of the screen, you have a Q&A button. If you'd like to ask any of the panelists any questions this evening, please click on that Q&A button and we'll be able to pose your question and your idea and your thought to the panelists that we have on. But we really have diplomats, we have rabbis, we have philosophers, we have politicians who've all come on this evening to discuss the enduring legacy that Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks really bequeathed to all of us. Before we actually begin, I just want to tell you about our last two webinars of the year, which will be taking place this weekend. On Saturday night, we're in fact going to be talking about DNA. We're going to Danny, I see you. There you go. So we're going to ask, who do you think you are? We're talking about Jewish DNA. Can you track your Sephardi and your Ashkenazi heritage? Are the Indian Jews genetically related to the Ashkenazi Jews? Are the Lemba part of the genetic tribe of the Jewish people? Is there a Kohen gene? There's generally presumed that the Lemba in the north of South Africa, in fact, possess the Kohen gene. Is that accurate? Is there a Kohen gene? And we'll also be talking about medical DNA, about many of the diseases that Jewish people suffer from and what you can learn by analyzing your DNA today, and what lifestyle choices you can take by actually knowing and understanding the secret code within your DNA too. And finally, on Saturday evening, we'll be talking about CRISPR. You'll notice that this year, in fact, the Nobel Prize went to two women who discovered a gene editing tool which allows you now to cure disease by editing genes, to maybe have children who are more muscular, who are taller, who are more intelligent. What are the ethical dilemmas that we have when we start playing with the human code of life? So that Saturday night, we're going to be discussing all of that in our webinar entitled, Who Do You Think You Are? And our final webinar of the year is in fact going to be on Sunday evening, and it's a Chanukah webinar. We, by popular demand, are bringing back someone who's going to be appearing this evening, and that's Isaac Buji Herzog, who's chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel. He'll be on a little later this evening, as well as on Sunday night. He will also be joined by Yair Lapid, leader of the opposition in Israel, the chief rabbi from South Africa, Chief Rabbi Dr. Warren Goldstein, and Yudi Cohen will be doing some musical interludes for us on Sunday night as well. So the last thing I want to tell you before I hand over to Sean for this evening is, I don't know if you've seen your latest edition of the Jewish Report. It came out today. If you haven't read it, for those guys sitting in the United Kingdom and Israel, we've started our second wave in South Africa. It all comes from people who finished school, went to major parties, and now we're experiencing a massive surge in coronavirus within South Africa as well. And our Minister of Health went on television yesterday evening and spoke about the beginning of the second wave. So we're covering that and many more stories in the Jewish Report this week. If you haven't picked up your copy, if we haven't delivered to your apartment block or your townhouse complex, please go to a Pick and Pay, a Woolworths, a Checkers, your garage shop, Exclusive Books, CNA, and pick up your free copy of the Jewish Report. It's going to be an amazing read this holiday, so you really don't want to miss it. It is the last edition of the year, and we'll be back with the next edition in the middle of January as well. With that, Sean, I want to hand over to you. We've divided this evening into a number of different segments to talk about different ideas and different concepts. So I hand over to you to introduce our guests for the first segment, and we'll see you in a little while when we light Chanukah candles.
Howie, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. It's a real honor and a privilege to be here this evening. First, let me welcome and once again thank Daniel Taub, who was the former Israeli ambassador to the UK, and is an esteemed and very famous diplomat and has visited our shores before. And of course, Rabbi Raphael Zarum, I would call him a very good friend. He's the Dean of the London School of Jewish Studies, and we'll talk more about them later on, but is also one of the world-renowned Torah educators. And so what we're going to do is, as Howie said, we're going to cover 4 segments, and we wanted to start off, before we get into some of Rabbi Sacks's key ideas, is to start perhaps with his ideas more generally. And before we start, we've just got a short video that we'd like to show before we begin the discussion. Danny, if you could play the first video, please.
So here is my simple suggestion. It might just change your life, and it might just help to begin to change the world. Do a search and replace operation on the text of your mind. And wherever you encounter the word self, substitute the word other. So instead of self-help, other help. Instead of self-esteem, other esteem. And if you do that, you will begin to feel the power of what for me is one of the most moving sentences in all of religious literature. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. We can face any future without fear, so long as we know we will not face it alone. So, for the sake of the future you, together, let us strengthen the future us. Thank you.
Great, thanks. We've just lost Daniel for a second. I'm sure he'll join us in a moment. But Rafi, just to start, while Daniel comes back, maybe if you could just take a few minutes to just tell us about your relationship with Rabbi Sacks.
Thank you very much, Sean. And it's wonderful to be here this evening and sharing with everybody. But I must be honest, it's still quite raw. On Sunday was the Shloshim, a month since he passed away. And for his students and many around the world, it's still a very sore and a sad moment that he's not going to be here. His new book has just come out, and I would be seeing him and talking, and we're missing all of that. So it's all very sad. I knew him for many years because when I was 18 years old, my mother bought me his first book for my birthday. And then I knew I'd get a birthday present every year because every year he'd write a different book and it would arrive in my house and I would read. And I worked for Bnei Akiva actually in my 20s, and his children went there. So I looked after his children in Bnei Akiva, and that built our relationship. And then later on, when I worked in formal education, he was always wanting to meet young people, the future leaders of the community. And we'd come round to his house for Shurim, and he would inspire us and encourage us along. And then when I got to run the London School of Jewish Studies, which he was the president and he'd been the principal of, he was always very supportive. It was always, what can I do? Or what do you need? And supporting us. And, he loved this place. He studied here, he lectured here, he got his smicha here, he became the principal here. This was his intellectual foundation. And to be part of it for me is a great honor. And to be honest, I miss him. I miss him.
As we all do. None of us knew him as well as you did, but we certainly do. Daniel, tell us a bit. You had the privilege of learning with him as an ambassador. Tell us about your relationship with Rabbi Sacks.
Yeah, that was an extraordinary privilege. I grew up in London, so I had a familiarity with him. I'd heard him speak on a number of occasions. There was one project that he'd invited me to become involved with when I was a young student, but it wasn't a close relationship. But when I went back as a diplomat to the UK, one of the standard operating procedures for the Israeli ambassador is to sit once a month with the chief rabbi and update him about what's going on in Israel. And he was very interested in what was going on in Israel, but I wasn't so interested in telling him about it. I said, let's just take 10 minutes at the beginning. I'll make some notes and we can cover the politics and the geopolitical situation and so on. But it's crazy that I should be spending my time with really the Talmid Chacham, an extraordinary Jewish mind and not taking advantage. I said, can we spend the rest of the time learning together? And he was very open to that. But the honest truth was, it didn't really work as a chavruta. The imbalance, I think, was too great. And so I said, look, if it doesn't really work as a chavruta, let's try a different model. Let's try the tutorial model that he's used to in Oxford and Cambridge. And so before we would meet, I would send him a list of 5 or 6 questions. I say, these seem to be the big issues of the day. Just choose one of them and talk about it. And it was such a pleasure and such a privilege. Really, I mean, we saw each other on other occasions, obviously, but for me, those quiet tutorial moments were something that were very, very special indeed.
That's amazing. So we chose the video that we just showed of his TED talk because I think it really captures, I think, if I can use the term, with the greatest respect, the Sacks factor. So maybe if you could give us, Daniel, if you could start, what do you think was the Sacks factor and why did it have such an important impact, or does it have such an important impact on people?
So first of all, I think you're absolutely right. I think the extent of the impact that we're seeing, I don't remember, certainly outside of a military conflict, chas v'sholom, something that has touched certainly the Jewish world so widely and so universally, and gone beyond the Jewish world in many ways. And I think the question that you ask is really, really an important one, and I don't think there's a full answer to it. But certainly the things that I would point to, I think they fall into 2 camps. One is the man, and the other is the message. And in relation to the man, you're talking about somebody who had an extraordinary range of talents. It wasn't a single talent. If you think about the different types of communication, whether it's writing, whether it's lecturing, whether it's using social media, and he was way ahead of his time in the way that he chose to use social media. He often spoke about how the Lubavitcher Rebbe was a big influence on him. And I think, in fact, this notion that technology is a tool for spreading the message was something that was very, very Chabad, if you like. And it wasn't that he had all of these talents. He worked on them. He really cultivated them. He honed his skills. He was one of the reasons that he had such wide reach was because he really wanted to have such wide reach. He felt he had a tremendously important mission, and that's why he worked so hard to spread it. And I think the message is also very significant. I think for many people in the Jewish world, one of his books is called To Heal the Jewish World, to Heal a Fractured World. But I think for a lot of people, he helped heal a fractured soul, if you like, a fractured personality. Here was somebody who could give a drasha, a sermon, that you weren't embarrassed that your university colleagues would hear. And he could write a book of philosophy that didn't make you feel like a heretic when you were reading it. It was a way of bringing the different parts of your personality together. There was a sense of wholeness to it. For people who are growing up outside of Israel, there's often a sense of dislocation. Am I this or am I that? And he would come up with ideas like the idea of cultural bilingualism, which he wrote about, that you have to be a member of your own community and at the same time learn the language of being an active member of the broader community. And he demonstrated that. So I think that was one very, very powerful thing. And amongst all the others, the one that I would choose, I think he was unusual amongst contemporary Jewish philosophers in that his philosophy was extraordinarily positive in its orientation. He would write about the Shoah, he would write about the challenges facing Israel and suffering and so on, but he never allowed those things to define the message that he was giving. His message was always one that we have to be, even when he was talking about the Shoah, one of the things that he would say is, the reason that the survivors didn't speak about their stories for so long was because you need to have a future before you can address the past. People like to say the opposite. We need to know the past before, but his orientation was tremendously forward-looking, looking for the positive, looking for the uniting factors and so on. So if I had to highlight some of the things that I think gave his message particular traction, I think those would be them.
Great. Rafi, your view on what created the Sacks factor?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many factors Daniel has said. I'll say two things. Number one is, and this I know from Anglo Jewry, he didn't just speak different ideas, he had an overall vision and message. And when he became chief rabbi, he announced what he called a decade of renewal. And what he was very good at is having a message and sticking with it and trying to inspire people along that path. And so for the first 10 years as chief rabbi, he talked about renewal of Jewish life in the UK, the increasing of schools. And as Daniel has mentioned, this connection that we can be part of the world as well as be committed to our faith. And then the second 10 years, he called responsibility, a decade of responsibility. Again, going out into the world and being proud and involved. So he always saw that he created a situation where we could galvanize around a message to move us forward. So you felt like you were living through a particular period of Jewish history. This is the chief rabbi's decade of responsibility. And what are you going to do about it? How will you be involved? And I think the second thing is, extending what Daniel said, is the pride that he gave us, that he could sit with heads of state and great philosophers and be respected. And don't underestimate how important that is for everybody else to put their head up high. Let me tell you one story as an example about this. So, as you know, he's a graduate of Cambridge University, but many years later, he was invited to the Guildhall, this amazing lecture hall, to give a very important lecture to the professors on a major theme of one of his new books. And I wasn't there for the evening, I couldn't make it, but the next day I was in the office and they were all talking about it. And I said, well, what happened? And they said, well, he gave this incredible lecture. He got a standing ovation from hundreds of people, of the leaders of Cambridge. And at the end, he got up and said it was the year his father had passed away. And he was still saying Kaddish for his father. And so after this great moment of all these incredible academics, Chief Rabbi said, and if there are 10 Jews who would like to pray Mariv with me, so I can say Kaddish, that would be great. And so they go downstairs and there's about 30, 40 Jewish academics and others, young students, davening. And Rabbi Sacks leads. He always liked to lead the davening when he could. He's leading, davening and saying Kaddish. And he gets to the Amida and there's an old Jewish history professor in the corner that just burst into tears and is crying the whole way through the Amida. And everyone's a bit whatever. And at the end, Rabbi Sacks goes up to him and says, are you okay? And he said, it's just too much. And he said, what? He said, Rabbi Sacks, you don't know this, but there's a modern synagogue in Cambridge, in Thompson's Lane. But it's not where it used to be. The medieval synagogue of Cambridge University was discovered in the ruins underneath the Guildhall. And he's done excavations there. And he said, Rabbi Sacks, no one has prayed in a minyan on this site for hundreds of years. And not only that, just now, you know, what were we 100 years ago? They took Jews seriously. They valued Jewish ideas in Cambridge. We were nothing. And now they're recognizing you as this great thinker, great Jewish leader. And then you come and pray in this synagogue and no one's prayed before. It's just too much for me. And Rabbi Sacks' office told me this story. And it's so inspiring, even now, you know, 10 years later to hear it, because he made us feel proud that, you know, one of us could do that. And if he can do that and be confident and they can respect us, then we can go out there and we can be respected and we can be confident. And we don't have to be embarrassed about our faith. And he would always say, if you're embarrassed about your faith, others will be. If you're proud of it, they will be as well. And that was the approach he gave. That's a very important achievement that he did. So he became a symbol and he managed that very, very well.
That's amazing. So then let me ask you, and Daniel, if you wouldn't mind starting. So what can we learn for ourselves? What can future leaders, influencers, how do we, in a way, take the Sacks factor and inspire and facilitate change?
That's a great question. But before that, just to pick up on what Rav Rafi said, this feeling of pride was almost tangible. You know, in my years in London, I had an opportunity to meet, you know, all sorts of people in leading figures in British life, non-Jewish. And the number of them who would confide in me that Rabbi Sacks was a particular source of guidance and inspiration for them was absolutely extraordinary. I had the opportunity to say, I mean, this is sort of name dropping, but it's relevant. I had the opportunity to sit next to Prince Charles on one occasion. And it's wonderful that he makes public statements now. But the thing that really struck me was that he had genuinely read and internalized the books of Rabbi Sacks that we had spoken about. This wasn't a superficial relationship. It was something that ran very, very deep. And you think about what it means that when somebody who is the heir to the throne thinks of what is a Jew, and possibly the first thing that comes to mind is somebody who is a personal inspiration to them. It's a Kirush Hashem in the very, very fullest sense of the word. To think of a couple of things that maybe we as leaders or educators could take away. I think the first one, I have to say, the hardest lesson to me, I think, and it's not in any of Rabbi Sacks's books, it's in his life. I was thinking about the first time I ever heard Rabbi Sacks speak. And I was probably 13 years old, and he came to try out as a young rabbi to be the rabbi of my parents' shul. And I don't remember what he said, but I do remember that he didn't get the job. And I heard him speak a couple of years later when I was in a youth group, and he came to speak, and he spoke very beautifully, but he was extraordinarily shy. And you know, from that period, just in advance of today, I was looking around my books, and I actually found this series of booklets, which at that time, I mean, Rafi may remember them. He took the time, which is a really beautiful thing, to write a series of booklets for young Jews in Britain addressing philosophical issues. You know, one is about the Holocaust, one is about faith and reason, and so on and so forth. And they're really, really lovely, but they are not a letter in the scroll, or not in God's name, or morality. And one of the things that I take is that you can be something considerably greater than you ever thought you were going to be. He is somebody, I think sometimes we do ourselves, you know, a favor, we cut ourselves some slack by thinking this is somebody who fell to earth with an extraordinary toolbox of talents. And the fact is, he did have an extraordinary toolbox of talents, but to a great degree, those were things that he worked on and improved. The first time he made a major speech in the United States was at an APAC conference, and I heard him speak there, but it was interesting. It was the second time I'd heard him give that speech, because a couple of weeks earlier, he had chosen to give the same speech as his sermon in a shul in London, because he wanted to be sure that he was getting it right. He wasn't somebody that took anything for granted. So I think if we're leaders, realizing that this is hard work is the first message. I think the second thing is the range of his deep, deep connections was extraordinary. I was particularly moved to see the tributes by progressive rabbis when he passed away. And I think one of the lessons that we can take away is that connection doesn't mean compromise. And in fact, the basis of those deep connections was almost the fact that he was tremendously authentic. And yet at the same time, he was looking for common ground. You know, the fact is he didn't give up on his core beliefs, but when he met somebody else, he would try to find, well, where is the place that we meet? Where is the place that we can move on together? And maybe just one last comment. I imagine it only slightly provocatively if there are Jewish leaders on the call. I think one of the things that enabled him to make such wide reach actually was the fact that certainly after he stopped being chief rabbi, he wasn't particularly associated with any particular organization or movement. He came across as an individual who cared about these things, and that made him very accessible to people. He wasn't asking people to sign up for a particular organization or particular label. He was saying, here are my ideas, here is our mission, come and join us. And there may be a lesson in there somewhere for Jewish organizations about the way that they think about encouraging engagement and commitment.
Daniel, thank you. That's extremely powerful thoughts. I know you've taken the time away from your children and grandchildren at the start of the Chanukah break. So we really do appreciate your time. You're welcome to stay, but you're also welcome to join your family.
I have to say, you have so many people that I'm a big fan of Rafi. I'm an enormous fan of Bushi Herzog, who is wonderful to see here. Gila Fine also. I mean, what an incredible evening you have. but I'm afraid you can't compete with my grandchildren. So I really am going to sign off now. Wish you all Chag Urim Sameach, and may you do well. May the memory of Rabbi Sacks rise in heaven and be spread further here on earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much for joining us. And to Isaac Herzog, Chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel, a huge welcome this evening. Just before we come to you, it is now sunset all over South Africa, and we'd like to light the first candle of Chanukah this evening. And Choni G has very kindly offered to do that for us tonight. So Choni, over to you.
Chanukah Sameach, everybody. All right. So we're going to do the blessings, and I encourage you, if you have your menorah out, light with me. We're going to do the blessings, and we're going to sing Ma'az Tzur, and Rob's here to accompany me. Let me just give me 1 second. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shekiddeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner Chanukah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam שעשה ניסים לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה. All right, we have liftoff. הנרות הללו אנחנו מדליקים, הנרות הללו אנחנו מדליקים על הניסים ועל הנפלאות ועל התשועות ועל המלחמות שעשית לאבותינו, שעשית לאבותינו בימים ההם, בימים ההם, בימים ההם, בזמן הזה. Okay, you all know the song, sing along with me. מעוז צור ישועתי לך נאה לשבח, תיקום בית תפילתי ושם תודה נזבח, לצחים אביה מצם נבח, אז אגמור בשיר מזמור חנוכת המזבח, אז אגמור בשיר מזמור חנוכת המזבח. יוונים נקבצו עליי, אזי בימי חשמנים, ופרצו חומות מגדלי, וטימו כל השמנים, ומינות הקרקנים נעשה נס לשושנים. בני בינה ימי שמונה קבעו שירו נענים, בני בינה ימי שמונה קבעו שירו
Choni, thank you so much. We'll come back to you. You're going to talk to us about your relationship with Lord Jonathan Sacks a little later, but really appreciate that. Thank
We'll
you.
do a song later.
You're going to do a song later as well. Absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
See you a bit later. Isaac Herzog, Chairman of the Jewish Agency, a huge welcome to you. We know your time is limited. We're going to be talking to you about the relationship between the Jewish people and the land and the state of Israel, and Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks' view on it. And we're going to kick off with a very short little video of Lord Sacks talking about the issue.
It was the most haunting of all prophetic visions. The prophet Ezekiel saw a valley of dry bones, a heap of skeletons. God asked him, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel replied, "God, you alone know." Then the bones came together and grew flesh and skin and began to breathe and live again. Then God said, "Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say our bones are dried up. Of dat tikvatenu, our hope is lost. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what God says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel." It was this passage that Naftali Herz Imber was alluding to in 1877, when he wrote in the song that became Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, the phrase, Od lo of da tikvatenu, our hope is not yet lost. Little could he have known that 70 years later, 1/3 of the Jewish people would have become, in Auschwitz and Treblinka and Bergen-Belsen, a valley of dry bones. Who could have been blamed for saying, our bones are dried up, our hope is lost? And yet, a mere 3 years after standing eyeball to eyeball with the angel of death, the Jewish people, by proclaiming the state of Israel, made a momentous affirmation of life, as if it had heard across the centuries the echo of God's words to Ezekiel, Veheveti etchem el admat Yisrael, I will bring you back to the land of Israel. And a day will one day come when the story of Israel in modern times will speak not just to Jews, but to all who believe in the power of the human spirit as it reaches out to God, as an everlasting symbol of the victory of life over death, hope over despair. Israel has taken a barren land and made it bloom again. It's taken an ancient language, the Hebrew of the Bible, and made it speak again. It's taken the West's oldest faith and made it young again. It's taken a tattered, shattered nation and made it live again. Israel is the country whose national anthem, Hatikva, means hope. Israel is the home of hope.
Isaac Herzog, talk to us about this love affair between the Jewish people and the land and the state of Israel.
And Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, may he rest in peace. He was really an outstanding human being, and when I hear his voice and it connects to the reference to Ezekiel's prophecy, I think it epitomizes a lot of his thinking, because undoubtedly the centrality of the state of Israel, and this is what I deal with every day, leading the biggest Jewish organization in the world, the Sochnut, the Jewish Agency. Undoubtedly, the centrality of Israel in Jewish life is actually a unique phenomenon of our generations, meaning since the establishment of the state of Israel. And sustaining it and going back to our roots, to our biblical roots, is something that has to be done. And I found Rabbi Sacks's thinking about it extremely fascinating. I'll tell you that I read a beautiful article about him by a Haredi author, Rabbi Yoshua Pfeffer, who writes that he approached Rabbi Sacks one day when he was walking in Jerusalem and said, "What are you doing here?" He said, I think I've finished being the rabbi of diaspora Jews. I now want to be the rabbi of Israeli Jews. in a way, it's true. He has impacted people all over the world. He has impacted people in Israel so substantially, but in his thinking, the love of Israel ran deep. His speeches from the House of Lords to anywhere else around the world has made a huge difference as to the connection of Israel to the Jewish people and Jewish people to Israel.
So I think one of the things that he spoke about, he said it's time for a new Zionism, Mark II, as he called it. He said Mark I of Zionism was the time where we create the state, a state for the Jewish people. And Mark II of Zionism is where we start imbuing that state with the traditional values that are Jewish. Now, I presume he didn't mean a theocratic state. I presumed he means something completely different.
True. He was a very encompassing human being. And from my conversations with him, I actually had a huge zchut of spending a sukkah evening with him, he and his wife, a year ago at the home of his brother, attorney Alan Sacks, who was a partner of mine previously at the law firm of Herzog, Fox and Neiman. And we spent the whole night. We even walked around Jerusalem for about an hour and a half afterwards, just digesting our meal. And he was a huge lover of the state of Israel, and he wanted to pour content which was content of morality, content of encompassing Judaism. That was his greatness. Basically, he hugged all Jews under the tent. And for him, every Jew was a Jew. And you never heard anything negative that he said about his fellow Jews. Rather, then he came and explained, and when came forward and explained how he saw things and how they should and ought to be done. He was a huge voice of reason on the one hand, and a huge deep voice of philosophy on the other. And for him, Israel is a central figure. I read this book every Shabbat. This is called Lessons in Leadership, weekly readings of the Jewish Bible, meaning Parashat HaShavua. The amount of issues that he raises about Israel, or in all aspects, as he speaks about leadership, is enormous. I even found, a reference to a beautiful little museum in Tel Aviv, Ben Gurion's home. When he speaks about knowledge of leaders, he compares Churchill's library, this one's library, and of course, Ben Gurion's library in Ben Gurion's home. Meaning he took symbols about what ought to be in terms of values and content and transformed them into his literature and thinking. His last book, Morality, is something we ought, all of us, to read, an incredible book which came out during COVID, and perhaps it's his will, his last will.
So one of the things that he spoke about was the resurrection of the Jewish people and of Jewish thought and of Jewish pride. Exactly. So how do we create a connection now between the people of Israel, Israelis, and Jews around the world? Because in some ways, there's almost a disconnect between the two. Jews in the diaspora feel so connected to Israel, but many Israelis feel that they're Israeli first rather than part of a much greater Jewish world.
I do accept your assumption, and I would say two things. One, Israelis are ignorant about world Jewry. They have no clue unless they spend time in those communities. And by the way, many, many, many Jews around the world have no clue about Israel. Let's not be mistaken. And therefore, what we do, for example, at the Jewish Agency, we are doing this connection the best way we can as almost the biggest Jewish organization focused at this, meaning we bring about 100,000 young Jews to Israel every year. Many of your community members come through Birthright Taglit, through Masa programs, Onward and Nale, and so many other programs. We bring to the communities about 4,000 emissaries every year, including in South Africa. We have incredible emissaries, including 18-year-old gap year Shinshinim. We have an incredible representative in South Africa, Liat Amar Aran, where you can meet at the Zionist Federation, of course, and people on the ground. We make partnerships between communities, like the one your community has with Bet Shemesh, and we are bringing any possible venue of connection. For example, on summer camps, about 2,000 emissaries every summer go on summer camps to introduce to each other. So by now, I have about a club of tens of thousands of people who are shlichim in the communities, who I'm asking them to bring the voice of world Jewry to Israeli society. Not only that, we've convinced the Ministry of Education in Israel to introduce a special teaching program about world Jewry for 7th and 8th graders in Israel, in order for them to understand that they're part and parcel of a nation state of the entire Jewish people around the globe.
So one of the things that really bothers Jews around the world at the moment is the issue of anti-Semitism. We've seen a massive rise in anti-Semitism, even during the period of COVID in Europe, certainly over the last few years in the United States as well. We've seen this massive rise in anti-Semitism. And Lord Sacks was, in fact, one of the great voices internationally in exposing anti-Semitism, taking on the Labour Party within Israel, within the UK, getting people to face up to it. What is your message to world Jewry based on his philosophy of how we should be dealing with anti-Semitism around the world today?
So first and foremost, I mean, anti-Semitism is a disease that has plagued humanity throughout the ages, and actually led to the most horrific atrocity of humankind in history. We still have with us casualties and survivors of that atrocity, and therefore it must be learned and taught all the time. And there is a three-tier way to deal with it. First and foremost, of course, on the practical level, has to be defensive, meaning make sure that nobody is hurt by helping assistance on security. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks was heavily involved with the SAST in England, of course, the Security Trust. And you've copied the same model in South Africa, and we, the Jewish Agency, are huge backers of this. Secondly, of course, adjudication and legislation in the nation states and in world organizations, meaning fighting, making sure, for example, that this new definition, which we call the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, that's a big multinational platform, will be implemented because it's wide enough and says also anybody undermining the nation state of the Jewish people's right to exist, not simply criticizing it, which is of course legitimate, but undermining our right for self-determination, is an anti-Semite. And lastly, of course, is education, the most important thing of all. Education, telling the story of the Jewish people. What Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, did was huge. He did Kiddush Hashem every day. His speeches in the House of Lords, his interviews in the BBC, his writings and books impacted people throughout the world and gave enormous pride for Jews to be Jewish. I can end by telling you an interesting story that during the Shiva, Alan Sacks told me that during Rabbi Sacks's hospitalization when he was ill at the end of his life, they received a letter from Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, telling him, we never met in person, but I read you're ill. You have no idea how much you have impacted my life. Simply an example of how he impacted so many human beings.
So in fact, the story, one of the stories you're telling was a BBC interview in which they said, you know, you conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And he said, let me tell you simply, you can criticize the British government. That's fine. But if you say that Britain has no right to exist as a country, then you understand what anti-Semitism is.
And that's why he was so revered. That's why the Prince of Wales asked to be at the funeral. And he was really something of a kind, special person.
So, Butchie, you are in fact joining us again on Sunday evening. You're going to be lighting Chanukah candles with our community on Sunday evening. You're going to be on our webinar with Yair Lapid as well, together with community leaders. I've promised Tal in your office that you would be off by exactly 10 to, I know
because I'm going to another webinar for Pittsburgh Jewish community.
You know that I appreciate the fact that not only are you working, but you're working for us at this moment. So really appreciate that. We'll see you Sunday evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Sean, what an amazing thinker. You have many more amazing thinkers to get through this evening.
Yes, so we're going to move on to the next idea. We seem to be a speaker short. Hopefully Sam will join us soon, but Rafi, we might be asking a bit more from you than you originally expected.
Okay.
But I think one of the most important ideas from Rabbi Sacks is both the idea of covenant and the idea of responsibility. So before we start, we just wanted to play another short video from Rabbi Sacks talking about the importance of being a Jew.
Sorry.
Uniquely, Jews are born into a faith. It chooses us before we choose it. Physically, we come naked into the world, but spiritually, we come with a gift, the story of our past, of our parents and theirs through almost 40 centuries. From the day Abraham and Sarah first heard the call of God and began their journey to a land, a promise, a destiny, and a vocation. That story is ours. It is a strange and moving story. It tells of how a family, then a collection of tribes, then a nation, were summoned to be God's ambassadors on earth. They were charged with building a society unlike any other, based not on wealth and power, but on justice and compassion, the dignity of the individual, and the sanctity of human life. A society that would honor the world as God's work and the human person as God's image. That was and is a demanding task. Yet Judaism remains a realistic religion. It assumed from the outset that transforming the world would take many generations, hence the importance of handing on our ideals to the next generation. It takes many gifts, many different kinds of talent, hence the importance of Jews as a people, because none of us has all the gifts, but each of us has some. We all count. We each have a unique contribution to make. We come before God as a people, each giving something and each lifted by the contributions of others. And yes, at times we fail or fall short, hence the importance of tshuva, repentance, apology, forgiveness, rededication. Judaism is bigger than any of us, yet it is made by all of us. And though Jews were and are a tiny people, today a mere 0.5% of the population of the world, we have made a contribution to civilization out of all proportion to our numbers. To be a Jew is to continue the journey our ancestors began, to help build a world that honors the image of God in every human being, and to be part of a people summoned by God to be his ambassadors down here on earth.
Great. Sam, welcome. Wonderful to see you. We're honored that you join us. Just to introduce you to our audience, Sam is a postdoctoral fellow in Jewish philosophy at the University of Haifa, but he really is one of the great dynamic Jewish educators, well known to many of us in South Africa. So we're delighted that you could join us. Thank you very much. We're having an amazing conversation, and we really wanted to pick up on this idea, which the video alluded to, which is the idea of covenant and Jewish responsibilities. So, Sam, maybe to start, just your idea about why his ideas about covenant had such a profound impact on both the Jewish community and also general society.
Right. So as I was preparing my thoughts for this discussion, I was very much thinking more about how Rabbi Sacks's thoughts about covenant impacted general society, and maybe Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zarum will be able to turn the conversation back at some point towards the influence of Rabbi Sacks's thinking of around covenant over the Jewish people and our community. But when Rabbi Sacks kind of rose to prominence in British intellectual life, and I think the Wreath lectures that he gave early on were a major point of kind of a meeting point between Rabbi Sacks and the wider British public, where there are these annual lectures given, the Wreath lectures, broadcast on the BBC. And already then he started to speak about, he was really thinking about covenant and how covenant is essential for a healthy public life in the body politic. He was concerned that politics at the time in Britain and the West was delegating certain responsibilities to one of two institutions. There was the market that was responsible for providing Rabbi Sacks was not opposed to the free market, and he saw what free market economy and a global economy can do to provide for greater living standards. So one institution upon which governments and people and societies were delegating responsibility, it was upon the market, and the other is the state and the welfare state, which provides, in Britain, it provides for our medical care. I don't live there anymore, but it provided for mine. It continues to provide for its citizens' medical care, for its protection, for legal regulations. All sorts of things get delegated to one or the other. And Rabbi Sacks was very aware that there's a massive gap in the middle between the market and the state. And it's in that gap in the middle where most of the important human relations that are fundamental to a healthy, flourishing society are supposed to operate. That's the family, the community, the public space. And markets can perhaps function on the basis of a contract. Laws in the abstract read quite contractually. But what a covenant is for Rabbi Sacks, I think, it's a contract made personal. It's a contract not between contractors, but between people who see one another, who recognize, in theological language, recognize the image of God in one another and have an interpersonal relationship. And I think for Rabbi Sacks, responsibility is born in that space, in the space of real interpersonal relations.
I mean, that's fantastic, and even more relevant, I think, in the world today than when those lectures were developed.
I agree, and I think Rabbi Sacks recognized that. I just wanted to say just one more thing. This resonated with the British public to such an extent that it's well known that he became a confidant of prime ministers, starting with John Major after the murder of James Bolger, this child who was murdered by two other children in a crime that shocked the nation. Rabbi Sacks wrote something about it, and his moral voice was so clarion that John Major invited him in, and from that moment began a relationship with him. But I think even more so with Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown, I think that there was this moment in British politics where there was a kind of new consensus building around New Labour, but New Labour was also inspired the Conservative Party to kind of follow suit. A new consensus built in which I think Rabbi Sacks's thought was a leading influence, and the thought was what I've said, which is that we have to think more broadly than just markets and states. We also have to think about communities.
So Rafi, then getting back to the covenant for Jews, how did Rabbi Sacks bring that idea to the Jewish people?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, for me, the two go together. I'm interested to what Sam thinks, which is that the reason he was able to talk in general society is because this idea of covenant between us and God, seeing the Bible as a political constitution, is something that actually he got very excited when his book came out, because he came up with the idea I'll explain to you, that the growth in the 16th and 17th century of political thought in Europe was very much related to what he saw in the Bible. And it turns out that actually a lot of these political philosophers and thinkers were reading translations of the Bible, and incredibly of Talmud and Zohar and Maimonides, into Latin, which was the language studied in universities at the time. And there's this book, I brought it with me because Rabbi Sacks got so excited when it came out because he knew about it. It's called The Hebrew Republic by Eric Nelson, where he shows historically that they actually were reading it as Christians, but they were beginning to see political ideas based from the Bible. And weirdly, in modern 20th century, economists and politicians had forgotten this. So it's like a religious Jew who knew the ideas on which they had studied in a secular sense was bringing back the origins of it and saying, you've lost the understanding, just as Sam said, about the markets, and understanding that you need another aspect of society. And he quotes Adam Smith and all the others who assumed this covenant aspect, but because that had been seen as religious, it was shorn away and become secularized. So it's the wildest thing. It wasn't him talking to the non-Jews, it was him teaching Torah, which was the basis of what was their philosophy without them knowing it. Would you say that's right, Sam? I mean, it's just
yes, incredible. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that the British intellectual classes and kind of historians, and they were aware always that the great liberal thinkers were inspired by the Bible. You know, even the more mainstream political thinkers like John Locke and the framers of the American Constitution, they were aware. But I think what Rabbi Sacks helped them to recognize is and exactly like you were saying, Rafi, that it took a kind of Jew to help them realize what it was that their own culture had actually been built upon, is that the biblical influence over these thinkers extended also to thinking about that community. The notion that, and I think that's exactly what had been missed by people perhaps who'd read their political philosophy and the history of political philosophy. They kind of missed what was being taken for granted, just like you said, Rafi, by Adam Smith and others. It was being taken for granted that all of these political institutions would only be flourishing in the context of communities built up of families, built up in interpersonal relationships, and that the covenant between the Jewish people and God wasn't merely a contract, but a covenant. It was based upon a personal relationship between.
And so as he spoke about this publicly, it made Jews feel, they're learning about the faith that I do this Shabbat. I'm doing what Rabbi Sacks is talking about. And they felt very inspired by that. And he had this amazing ability to bring it down to reality. He's like, what's the measure of a successful country? Is it GDP, how much money you've made? Is it political power? Or is it, the health service, the gap between the rich and the poor? The happiness quotient that came out a few years ago. He was very excited about that. Alternative measures of what makes good society. He was able to talk about that. And a great metaphor he used in The Politics of Hope, which is a wonderful example, is parks.
Yeah.
What the value of a park in a society where you can walk along there, everyone's equal, on a Shabbat afternoon. And in fact, the week after he passed away, that first Shabbat, I went for a walk in our local park in Finchley to Avenue House. And I'll tell you why. But one reason was because of this idea that we can walk around and we're all part of society. I could be British, there could be a Muslim, a Chinese person there. Everyone walking is part of this place that's open to enjoy nature and God's world in the park. I also went there because there's a bench If you go in the main entrance, you make a right, you go past the Spike Milligan bench, and 3 up, it says, "This bench is dedicated in the memory of Louis Sacks. It was donated by Rabbi Sacks's brother, Brian, to that park because Rabbi Sacks's father used to love walking there." And I remembered that. And I think that's one of the reasons Rabbi Sacks loved it so much. So I couldn't be close to him, but walking in that park, thinking of his ideas, seeing the bench, so I'm getting emotional. The Shabbat after made me think. He wanted us to live these things, you know, to really live them. And so it felt very special to be there.
And you know, Rafi, like you said, not only did his role to, you know, as an ambassador of Jewish thought to political leaders on the front line of kind of British politics and changes in British politics, not only did that inspire Jews to take pride in their Judaism, I think he played a similar role for Jews and their Judaism as he did for British political culture and its own history, which is to say he also helped us to personalize our Judaism. You know, Rabbi Sacks, it seems to me, had such a personal relationship with God. And I've been rereading with my daughter a much more accessible book of his, Celebrating Life. Celebrating Happiness, Celebrating Life. What's it called? Celebrating Life. Yeah, and it's got many beautiful parts in it, but I think none of them are as beautiful as the parts where he talks about his personal relationship with God, and what it means for man to be created in the image of God is to recognize that God is also a person, personal just like us. And I think he made our Judaism more personally alive, more lived. He inspired us to kind of feel that.
Absolutely. I'll tell you a great story from when every year he'd fly to Israel to be with the Yeshiva Bochers and Sem girls in their year off in Israel. And I was living there for 2 years, so it was a big Shabbaton. I got to go as well. And Shabbat afternoon, there'd be a Q&A. And one year, he was very tired. He goes, "Rafi, you do it, and I'll sit on the side." And I knew what was going to happen, right? So they asked the questions, and I answered the simple questions. As soon as it got hard, I kept on looking round for when he was ready to answer. And at one point, one of the boys got up, and he was just become more religious. You could tell this boy was like, wanted to see. And he said, "What does the Rav think is the avodah of this door? What does the rabbi think is the challenge of this generation?" And I could see he was very religious, and he wanted a very religious answer. And I said, "Rabbi Sacks," and he got up and he said, "Let me tell you," he said, "about the Ahavat Shalom." He was a Hasidic Rebbe. And the Ahavat Shalom showed us that every Sedra is really about loving God. And about loving God and about loving our fellow man and caring in the world, right? And Rabbi Sacks is telling this story, and I'm thinking, it's unusual he's going in this direction, And then he says, and then the Talmidim of the Ahavat Shalom came to him and they said, but Rav, what about the Parsha of Korach? It's all about internal fighting of Jew fighting Jew. Is it really about love? And then the Ahavat Shalom said, but the gematria of the first line of the Sedra of Korach adds up to a hafta l'recha kamocha. Love your neighbor as yourself. And I'm sitting there thinking, I've never in my life heard Rabbi Sacks quote a gematria. What's he doing? And he goes, Hashem said, yes, the gematria of the first pasuk of Korach adds up to hafta, love your neighbor as yourself. And then he said, but the Talmidim then came to the Rav and said, but Rav, we've done the maths and it doesn't add up. The gematria of love your neighbor as yourself is not the same as the first line of Korach. And the Ahavat Shalom said, I know. But when it comes to love, it doesn't have to add up. And I'm sitting there thinking, and then he looked at them and he said, when you go back to London, when you go back to England University, I want you to love your fellow Jew. It doesn't matter how religious they are. If they're not as religious as you, I want you to care for all of them as part of your people. And I could see he got right to them with that story. Right, and also being playful about gematria, which helped me understand his approaches. But that's the way he would do these things. But he really cared about our responsibility for every other Jew, and that's what comes out of covenant. Right, that responsibility becomes fundamental. Right, and I used to always say to him, Rabbi Sacks, you have to explain how why putting on my tefillin makes the world a better place. To link those two worlds. Because the idea of Tikkun Olam had become a progressive issue, that Orthodox halachas and the progressive went out. And he looked at me, he's like, what are you talking about? It's one, Rafi, it's all interconnected. And his book, To Heal a Fractured World, about Jewish responsibility, was very much about that idea of how it's all one, and not to think of two worlds. There's just one world.
Yes, and I think that's this analogy between his role as a public intellectual to the Gentiles and as our rabbi at the Jewish community, that Judaism can sometimes become so focused on the external observances and lose its spirit. Very similarly to this story about Korach that you raised, Rafi. I mean, he said in Covenant and Conversation on Parshat Bereshit, he said every single detail of the Torah is included solely for ethical and spiritual instruction. And it's actually not very easy to read every single of the detail of the Torah as being there solely for ethical and spiritual instruction. But ultimately, sorry, there's some sort of sound.
Some sort of echo. I think it's okay. Sorry, keep going.
But ultimately, I think that's what Rabbi Sacks truly believed, that until every single aspect of our Jewish practice somehow resonates right down into your kishkas, creating you into a more spiritually sensitive and more ethical being, a person who rises to his or her own responsibilities. You've missed the point. You've missed the point of Judaism, much like a state that delegates everything to its formal institutions, be it the market or be it the state, has also very much missed the point. It's kind of dead on the inside.
Sam, thank you. That's extremely powerful thoughts and ideas. And I know you and Rafi would love to carry on this conversation, but we want to pick up one more important idea before we draw the evening to a close. We'd love for you to stay, but feel free to log off. But we're delighted to be joined by Gila Fine, who's the editor of Maggid Books. And we were going to play a short video clip, but I'm going to skip it at the moment because I know this conversation could go on for a little bit longer. And this is an amazing evening, but we do at some stage have to bring it to a close. But I think that the last idea we wanted to talk about, which I think is perhaps the most interesting one, or a very important one really, is how Rabbi Sacks spoke so openly and honestly about God. And maybe, Gila, just your thoughts on what was so special about how Rabbi Sacks related to God and how he brought it back into the conversation.
So Chanukah Sameach, everyone. It is very lovely to be with you. Hi, Rafi. I can say quite personally that I've spoken about Rabbi Sacks at numerous events over the past month, and this one feels quite different. And I think it's because it's the first night of Chanukah, and it doesn't feel altogether sad. It feels there's a dissonance between the sadness that I generally feel when talking about Rabbi Sacks and the joy that we're meant to be feeling right now. And I think, you know, we've passed the Shloshim, and perhaps it's time to begin celebrating Rabbi, not just mourning his death, but actually celebrating his life. To talk about God, I've been asked on several occasions over the past month to summarize Rabbi Sacks's philosophy, and it can't be done. It cannot be done. It's too vast and it's too varied. But I will say that one theme that comes up again and again in all of his books, in all of his writings, is a theme of relationships. It's very much a way in which Rabbi Sacks looked at the world. The market was for him a relationship. The state was a relationship. Communities were a relationship. Families were certainly a relationship. And I want to say that God for Rabbi Sacks was first and foremost a relationship, not an abstract philosophical idea or theological article of faith or even a biblical literary character. God was a very real, very personal, very intimate relationship that we each of us have. He wrote, and I'll quote him, "The God to whom we speak in prayer is not the ultimate power, but the ultimate person, the other in whom I find myself." But it's very hard if you've been brought up on the traditional view of God to actually have this relationship. Because God, we know, is infinite and we are finite. God is omniscient and we are fallible. God is all powerful and we are vulnerable. And this is all philosophically true. I'm sure Sam would agree. But it's no way to have a real honest relationship. And so what Rabbi Sacks does brilliantly is he flips the script. He absolutely reverses the way that we're used to thinking about the man-God relationship. We say that we believe in God. Rabbi Sacks says it's God who believes in us, even when we don't believe in ourselves. We say that we need God. Rabbi Sacks says it's God who actually needs us, because we're the ones who complete God's work of creation. We say that we call out for God's mercy. Rabbi Sacks says that it's God is the one who calls on us. And if you'll allow me to quote, because really nobody can articulate Rabbi Sacks as well as Rabbi Sacks. This is from Radical Then, Radical Now. Abraham asks God, "Where are you?" God replies, "I am here. Where are you?" Man asks God, "Why did you abandon the world?" God asks man, "Why did you abandon me?" So begins a dialogue between earth and heaven that has no counterpart in any other faith, and which has not ceased for 4,000 years. In these questions, which only the other can answer, God and man find one another.
Wow, that's powerful. Rafi, your thoughts about what he did to bring God back into the conversation?
No, I think Gila's so right. She's showing us how, by choosing the right quotes to explain how Rabbi Sacks changed our understanding of that relationship. We normally think of God's way up there, but he's seeing us face to face. And, that's the truth underneath which we talked about with Sam of covenant, where we come to God as an equal, which is an incredible thing that God allows us to do. And that makes it more intimate and so much more personal. It's such an important part. And there's a quote I had, a very similar one about treating God as a person, which is truly wonderful and important. I want to add another aspect of it. First of all, I think what grew for him, he always had this, but when he translated originally the United Synagogue Singer's Prayer Book, which would be translation, he wasn't planning to do that originally. The old one they'd made had been printed on the wrong stuff, and they needed to redo it. And they had actually a committee of people to do it. But the story goes that they've been working on it, and one summer he comes downstairs from his office, right, with these two folders, and he basically retranslated the entire Siddur. He was going to do a few amendments, but he retranslated the entire Siddur, and I think it changed him, his ability to actually write the translation of what our prayers are, made him think and focus on it for many years, and that led to the Siddur and the Zarum. And his translation is again, like you're just talking about, very intimate. So instead of hear Israel, it becomes listen Israel. It talks to you one-to-one. And I'll bring one example, which is a famous one I like to talk about, which I think Sam will really like. The names of God. Rabbi Sacks could unify ideas brilliantly. So there's one of the brachot in the Amida, we say, Bruchata Hashem, Hatov Shimcha, Ulacha Ne'el Hodot. It's one of the three brachot at the end of every Amida we say all year round. And what does it mean? Bruchat Hashem, blessed are you, O God, Hatov Shimcha, whose name is goodly or beneficence, Ulacha Ne'el Hodot, and for you it is correct to praise. How does Rabbi Sacks translate it? And Sam will get this straight away, but it's so clever. He said, whose name is the good. And he translates the good with a capital G and puts the good in quotation marks, Sean. Why would you have the good, a translation, in quotation marks? So he says, whose name is the good and to whom it is right to thank. And Sam knows the good is the project of Western philosophy, how to live a good life. What does it mean to be a good person and to live a meaningful life? And Rabbi Sacks says, that whole challenge? That's one of the names of God. And when you work on being a good person, on understanding value, you are connecting, which brings us back to Gila's point, back to God, right? Now, when I saw this in the Siddur, I was like, there's no commentary, sure, there's no explanation of it, right? This is a little secret that you and I and a few hundred people are listening to now. But he's basically saying that all of this Western thought of this idea of what it means to be human, the humanist aspect of philosophy, is actually divine. It connects us to God. And in his grandson's bar mitzvah last year, I went up to him and said, finally, can I ask you, is that what you meant? And he gave the most wonderful grin at me, which I think is his answer. But I think it's that connection to God that was so important, so much so that even an atheist could be inspired by him. There's a famous story of Rebecca Goldstein, who's this famous humanist. She wrote 36 arguments for the proof for God, but actually it's about she wasn't a believer in God, and she won this humanist. She wrote this wonderful book about Spinoza, portraying Spinoza, a brilliant teacher, brought up religious but secular now, in her own words, and she won this Humanist of the Year award. And Rabbi Sacks wanted to congratulate her and wish her Mazel Tov. He knew her, right? And just because she wasn't a believer in God doesn't mean he couldn't talk to her. So he sent her a present. And what do you send a present to someone who doesn't believe in God? He sent his new Siddur as a present to her, right? And what was her response? She wrote back and said, I want you to know, Rabbi Sacks, that I am the Lord's loyal opposition, right? That I might not be a believer, but I respect God. And he had that ability to talk about God to people who didn't necessarily even believe, right? I'll tell you one little more story on this. We'll go back, which is there was a great BBC broadcaster called John Humphreys. Remember him, Sam? He was everyone talked on the radio. He interviewed everybody. And John wrote a book. He wasn't an atheist. He was what you call an agnostic. An agnostic is someone who's not sure. Right? And normally people who believe in God don't like it. They say, make up your mind, or atheists don't make up your mind. He's like, no. He was brought up Christian. He said, I was brought up with this faith. I find it hard to believe in God. I can't say I'm sure, but I won't believe there's nothing. And I'm an agnostic. And so he wrote a book called In God We Doubt. It's very cheap. It's really worth getting. It's a wonderful, where he has a conversation with 3 religious leaders. Tariq Ramadan, this very scholarly Muslim, Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. And in each of the conversations, he asks, but tell me why I should believe in God. What is God? Right? And each of them answers. It's a beautiful book because it's very easy to read. And at the end of the book, he writes at the end, after speaking to them, he goes, I'm still an agnostic. I'm still confused. But Jonathan Sacks got the closest. So me just reading it, and I met him afterwards, and he told me this. Why did he write that? He said, because I want to believe, Raphael. I find it hard, and he makes it easier. He makes it real. He makes it human. He makes it intimate. So it's very powerful to have that reach. And for so many people out there, I know we all have doubts. We sometimes see God in our lives, sometimes we don't. But Rabbi Sacks would say, okay, so let's talk about it. Let's try and understand and work at belief in God. The first commandment isn't a tick. Honoring your parents. I honor my parents. Did I yesterday? Do I now? Will I tomorrow? It's a relationship, as Gila said. And believing in God is a relationship. We have to work on that through prayer, through actions, through imitation of God, and through seeing God in the face of the other. It's all interconnected.
Sam, you were about to say something.
I was just going to say, I think, when Rabbi Sacks passed away, I realized for the first time to what extent I wasn't just a student of his, but I was basically a chassid. And the way that a chassid relates to the Rebbe, it isn't just as a teacher, because the Rebbe has such a tangible and meaningful relationship with God that he lives in the presence of God all the time. And by living in the presence of God all the time, when you meet him, when you meet the Rebbe, you feel like you're also in the presence of God because he's always in the presence of God. There was something, and I didn't really think about this when he was alive, but I recognize it now. To be with Rabbi Sacks, you felt you in the presence of a majesty, and you felt you in the presence of a warmth and a love. That was a reflection of the majesty and warmth of love of God that Rabbi Sacks lived in the presence of the whole time. And that we, his students, and I think anybody, it's amazing to hear his voice still. I hadn't heard him speaking for a little while, and it made me kind of tear up again just to hear him speaking, because his voice is so alive. But I know that people who never met him will also be able to get a taste of this. But I think the people who knew him, they felt also that he had tremendous faith in every person that he met. And he said, I've said this before, but he said that his life was shaped by a handful of people, the Bavitcher Rebbe included, Rav Soloveitchik probably included, Rav Nachum Rabinovich probably included, his wife, I'm sure, included. He said that his life was shaped by a handful of people who had more faith in him than he had in himself. And I think a lot of his students felt that he, Rabbi Sacks, had more faith in us, his students, than we have in ourselves. But I think also that faith was a reflection of the faith he thought God had in all of us, right? Because for Rabbi Sacks, God is a person who engages in a faithful, loving relationship with the Jewish people. And that's why it's not surprising to hear that John Humphreys can sit in a room with Rabbi Sacks, and okay, he might not be intellectually convinced that God exists, but he felt something with Rabbi Sacks, you know, and you'd be a very hard heart not to.
Yes, I mean, as we've been watching some of these videos preparing for the webinar, it is every video is moving, reading morality. You can really feel his voice. But maybe just as we start to bring the evening to a close, Gila, you know, what's interesting, and it's a bit about the Humphreys point that Rafi's raised, you know, he spoke so much about God, yet he appealed to the non-Jewish world. Why do you think that happened? How did he cross that bridge?
I think the answer to that is probably overdetermined. We can talk about his very savvy use of social media and technology. We can talk about how he very strategically built bridges into various worlds. But going back to Rafi's point about the content of what he spoke about, sort of, I very much see the Humphreys point, because Rabbi Sacks could talk about God. He's one of the only rabbis, I think, who could talk about God in a way that made secular or atheist people really listen. And I think it's because, to go back to my original point about relationships, Rabbi Sacks said that God was a relationship, but it wasn't just that God was a relationship, a real and personal relationship we each of us have. God, for Rabbi Sacks, was the prerequisite for any relationship we have. He spoke about finding God in the relationships we create. God mediates, for Rabbi Sacks, between man and man. And so if you try and take God out of the picture, as atheists do, as the West in general has been doing over the past few centuries, what will happen is that all relationships will begin to disintegrate. The sanctity of marriage gets hurt, communities crumble, societies fall apart. And this is one of the pervasive ills that Rabbi Sacks identified and spent his life fighting against. He spoke out powerfully against our loss of solidarity and mutual responsibility, against people putting the I before the we, against the loneliness and alienation that so many people in the West feel. And I think this is a message that is so much greater than the small religious community. Anybody who looks around the world and wonders how we've ended up in this state, why we are in the mess that we're in, can draw hope from Rabbi Sacks. So Rabbi Sacks says, you know, if you bring God back, we will be able to rehabilitate our relationships, the bonds between man, and return to a moral and meaningful life. Rabbi Sacks tries to bring God back in, not for the sake of God, but for the sake of man. He is, for Rabbi Sacks, faith, religious faith, or maybe more broadly, belief in God, is really the best way to lead a fully meaningful, fully good human life. Once again, I think I'm going to let Rabbi Sacks do the talking, because he does it so much better than any of us. He says, there is no life without a task, no person without a talent, no place without a fragment of God's light waiting to be discovered and redeemed, no situation without its possibility of sanctification, no moment without its call. It may take a lifetime to learn how to find these things, but once we learn, we realize in retrospect that all it ever took was the ability to listen. When God calls, he whispers our name, and the greatest reply, the reply of Abraham, is Hineni, here I am, ready to heed your call, to mend a fragment of your all too broken world.
Wow, Gila, that's extremely powerful, and in some ways a perfect way to start bring what is an extraordinary evening to a close. So maybe just the last point is first to Gila, just some advice for all the people listening from around the world. How I mean, you're the editor-in-chief of Maggid Books, so the answer may be obvious, but how do we continue to access his ideas? How do we continue to bring his legacy alive? What's your advice for us?
Read his books. Try and contain your shock at my saying that. Read his books, read his books, read his books, read his books, read his books. Also, listen to his videos. Find, his recordings. They're all over YouTube, and listen to those, because as Sam says, there's something about his presence, even through, your iPhone that will come through. But read his books. There's a reason I struggle very much to talk about Rabbi Sacks, and all I really want to do, as I've done somewhat here tonight, is just read things that he's written, because he is the greatest Jewish voice of our time. He is one of the greatest Jewish voices of history. I think it's going to take generations before we realize just how immense his contribution to our world has been. And when you do read his books, commonplace, highlight the things that speak to you the most, and live your life in light of those. Rabbi Sacks was amazing at writing very practical philosophy. He was really good at summarizing complex ideas into sound bites that you can really put on your iPhone screen, or put on a post-it note on your computer screen, or put somewhere which can be before your eyes at all times. Find the message that speaks to you the most right now, that you most need to hear, and take it into your life. And nobody can take Rabbi Sacks's place. I don't know when humanity, and the Jewish people specifically, will be lucky enough to have somebody else like him. But I think the one thing we can do now is for each of us to take a little bit of him and to carry on one small piece of what he tried to do. And maybe if we all really put our minds to it, then, all of us together can begin to come close to be filling some of that void.
Thank you. Rafi, your thoughts? I know you have got a series of events and quite practical things that the community can take advantage of. Give us your thoughts about how to.
Well, I want to agree with you, but I want to agree with you, but I want to add more, which is that you must read his books. That's what you do. But every time you come across a source, a reference in the Tanakh or the Talmud, I want you to look it up and read it and think, what do you think it means? Rabbi Sacks was a guide to Torah. But the aim is not to look at him, but to look at the Torah he showed us. He framed it beautifully for us, good for you to see. If you want to be shocked by this, there's a video he did in January with Tortoise, which is this literary group, not a non-Jewish group, about his new book, Morality. And he said the most amazing thing. This is a 72-year-old man. He said, I've discovered in my life that I'm a very compelling speaker. I can be very convincing. And that's very dangerous, because in the wrong hands, it can be abused. So I've tried in the last few years to be less compelling, to just explain to you my thoughts so that you can take them and think what you think and live the meaning that you find. That's what he wanted for us. So yes, read the books and follow it, not to worship him, but, and as Sam said, but that presence to help you, let him take you by the hand and bring you closer to God. That's what that does. And to do that, you have to read the books, and you have to look at the sources and be empowered to go on your path to God. It's a very subtle thing with the Hasidic relationship of the Rebbe. The Rebbe doesn't get in the way between you and God, right? In youth camps, a nice simple metaphor, in youth camps when you're a kid, you say to the kids, look at me, I'm Abraham, I'm Moshe Rabbeinu, here's something. You create reality in youth camps for kids. But when you take them on Israel tour, you don't say, look at me, you say, look behind me. You see that? That's a temple in Jerusalem. You see that? That's Jewish life. And Rabbi Sacks was saying, look beyond me, look to the sources I'm showing you to find your meaning. He can be a guide to help us do that, but you have to find your meaning in your Torah. And that empowerment, he believed in us, hence the believe in us more than we believe in ourselves. So that the key is for me. So that's what I say, look at that Tortoise video. We on the 20th are having a special evening at LSJS. It's online on the website, LSJS, where we're looking at his latest book, Judaism's Life-Changing Ideas, and his Talmidim. which is Gila here and Sam, are each going to teach one idea that changed their lives from him, right? And for me, I know, Gila, you say nothing can replace him, but I believe the students are going to what continues afterwards. The greatness of a teacher is the greatness of their students. So we're going to do that. And then in February, and again, I learn anywhere. I don't mind if you do it with us or anywhere, just learn his stuff. But at LSJS, and from February, once every 2 weeks, we're going to take an hour to take one of his ideas and go in more depth. Again, from the Talmudim. I've got 20 or 30 of them doing it. And Gideon Sylvester's going to do community, and Sam, Rabbi Sam in February already, is going to do an hour on Darchei Shalom, the ways of peace, taking Rabbi Sacks's ideas, going back to the original sources and explaining what he meant. And every 2 weeks online on our website, and you can sign up and get it, we'll be learning these ideas. So for us, his Talmidim and Talmidot, the way we continue is by sharing his ideas and sharing what we love about them and how it helped us have a closer relationship with our tradition and our faith and with God.
And so also just for everyone's here in South Africa, our own Academy of Jewish Thought and Learning, and Rav Ramon Woodmont is also doing in the new year teaching of his ideas and thoughts. And so
absolutely.
Please
LSJS, my college works in partnership with Ramon, absolutely, yes.
So Rabbi Sacks had a one-line piece of advice to me. He said, it's a very simple or perhaps not so simple principle. He said, may everything you do be a Kiddush Hashem. And the idea is that we should be learning what he had to teach us. We should be inspired from what he taught us to learn more Torah generally, but it shouldn't stop there either. He believed, like Hashem believes in us, that we each have the capacity, the ability to do amazing things that are greater than any of us thought we could do. And we can make, if not everything we do, then we can at least strive to make everything we do be a Kiddush Hashem. We should sanctify God's name through the way we act in this world.
Amen. Amen.
Right. Rafi, Sam, Gila, we're immensely grateful. You've given so generously of your time. We really do appreciate it. We've still got some more from Choni, so we're looking forward to that. But thank you very much. And Howie, over to you.
Thank you. Rafi, I see we've had a few requests for people who would like to register to be part of your learning program and to understand more and potentially get hold of some of the books that you're producing over there. Can you post some of that information in the chat section, please? We'd be very grateful.
Yes, I will try.
And just before we go over to Choni, Rafi, one question that I asked you is, from the outside, it always looks like the British establishment is anti-Semitic, that it would be very hard for them to accept a Jew within their own ranks. But within Lord Sacks, you see someone who was knighted by the Queen. You see someone who Prince Charles had a personal and intimate relationship with. You see complete acceptance. Has there been a change in British aristocracy? Was Sacks unique, or has Britain itself changed?
Well, as long as you were part of general society, we don't have a multiculturalism in the way of America did. We had British society. And if you could speak eloquently and were part of British society, then they're open to talk to anybody. That's what I really believe. And because Rabbi Sack could speak in that language, again, in that Torsos video, he explains, he said, look, I went to university, I went to Cambridge, I've got a PhD in political philosophy, I can speak their language. And so they could understand. And that was why. I don't think anti-Semitism is inherent. It's a disease, as Buzzy said earlier, and it gets in the way. And England has a great love affair, Britain with Arabs through Lawrence of Arabia and all those issues. But if someone can speak in their way, and we are based on the church as well, if they can speak about God in a way people can relate to, then we can get past that. I don't think anti-Semitism is essential. It's really bad when you start thinking that people hate us no matter what, you go wrong. It's not true. It's not true. Shall I tell you an appropriate joke? No, I won't tell you this joke. Another time.
No, tell us the story, and then we'll go listen to Rabbi Sacks talk about Chanukah before we hear.
Well, what's the difference between Jews and Rabbi Sacks would never say this. What's the difference between Jews and anti-Semites? So anti-Semites hate Jews, but they quite like their friend, their neighbor, Cohen the lawyer. He's a really nice guy. Whereas Jews love all Jews, but they really don't like their neighbor, Cohen the
lawyer. Thank you all for joining us. We're actually going to spend a few moments and listen to what Rabbi Sacks taught us about Chanukah. So Danny, if you could play us that video, please.
There's a fascinating argument in the Talmud. Can you take one Hanukkah light to light another? Usually, of course, we take an extra light, the shamash, and use it to light all the candles. But supposing we don't have an extra light, can we take the first candle and use it to light the others? Two great sages of the 3rd century, Rav and Shmuel, argued about just this. Rav said no, Shmuel said yes. Now, normally we have a rule that whenever Rav and Shmuel disagree, the law follows Rav. There are only 3 exceptions, and this is one. So let's ask, why did Rav say you may not take a Hanukkah light to light others? Because, says the Talmud, komachish mitzvah, you diminish the first candle. Inevitably, you spill some of the wax or the oil, and Rav says don't do anything that would diminish the light of the first. But Shmuel disagrees, and the law follows Shmuel. Why so? The best way of answering that question is to think of 2 Jews, both religious, both committed, both living full Jewish lives. One says, I mustn't get involved with Jews who are less religious than I am, because if I do, my own standards will fall. I'll keep less. My light will be diminished. That's the view of Rav. The other says no. When I use the flame of my faith to light a candle in someone else's life, my Jewishness is not diminished, it grows, because there's now more Jewish light in the world. When it comes to spiritual goods as opposed to material goods, the more I share, the more I have. If I share my knowledge or my faith or my love with others, I don't have less, I have more. That was the view of Shmuel, and that's how the law was eventually decided. So, share your Judaism with others. Take the flame of your faith and help set other souls on fire. Happy Chanukah. Chanukah Sameach.
Choni, tell us, you in fact met Rabbi Sacks. Tell us about your encounter.
It's been so beautiful to be on this panel and listen to all of you. It's not like a crazy story. I saw him in the airport, and I went up to him like a million other Jews. I was flying from Cape Town to New York and via London, and when I got to my gate, I was sitting there waiting for the flight to board, and I saw him come on. So I introduced myself to him. I knew he knew my dad because he'd been to Sydenham. My dad's Rabbi Yossi Goldman from Sydenham Shul. That's what the G is for, and I knew that he also wrote a testimonial on my dad's book. So I knew there was a relationship. So I introduced myself, and I spoke to him. This is a few years back. He spoke about music, told me what he was doing with the Shabbaton choir, and about music and with wonder and awe, and and then so I have a regret that because my album came out only a year ago, and I think that he would have really liked it. So I would have loved to send it to him, for him to hear it, because I heard, I think at the eulogy of that Rabbi Lionel Rosenfeld, I think he might have mentioned this, that he spoke about urging him to keep the music modern and relevant and not be stuck in the past. And a lot of the songs on my 5780 album are like Anglo-Saxon shul songs, but I've jazzed them up a lot, made them very modern. So I think that he would have really liked that. So that's just a thing, I was thinking about it the other day. But yeah, and then I saw him last year. I was in a gig in London, and I was in the Hampstead Heath, and I saw him and his wife walking, and I was about to go say, and I was like, no, I'm going to leave him, let him enjoy his walk.
So you're going to be singing Noseh Shalom for us. Tell us why.
Yeah, so this is a song I think that he really loved. If you can correct me, but I think it was composed for the album, the City of Hope. I'm not sure if it was composed for that, but it was definitely on the album in 2008 for Israel's 60th that he put together. And Noseh Shalom B'Mromav. So I'm gonna do that version. And he was a man of peace. across bridges, across all walks, a unifier. So that's what Oseh Shalom B'Mamav is all about. He who makes peace in the heavens should make peace down below.
Cool.
And then I might have another song that he liked.
Cool.
Okay,
Take it away.
All right. Oseh Shalom B'Mamav V'yaseh Shalom Shalom Aleinu Ve'akol Yisrael Ve'akol Yisrael Ve'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom B'Mamav V'yaseh Shalom Shalom Aleinu Ve'akol Yisrael Ve'akol Yisrael Ve'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom Shalom B'Mamav V'yaseh Shalom Shalom Aleinu Ve'akol Yisrael Ve'akol Yisrael Ve'imru Amen. La 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 la. Ah, la 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 la. Ah, la la. Ooh, na 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 na. Oseh Shalom Shalom B'Mamav V'yaseh Shalom Shalom Aleinu Ve'akol Yisrael Ve'akol Yisrael Ve'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom Shalom B'Mamav V'yaseh Shalom Shalom Aleinu Ve'akol Yisrael Ve'akol Yisrael Ve'imru
Choni, we can't let you go without a nigun. Surely you have spiced up so many of our webinars with some fantastic Hasidic nigunim and music.
Okay, so this one is, it's interesting. I didn't know this, but when I watched the eulogy, Rabbi Rosenfeld, Lionel Rosenfeld, and when he sang Tzama Lecha Nafshi, my soul thirsts for you, from the Tehillim, the nigun that was composed by and Rabbi Lionel Rosenfeld spoke about how he loved, Rabbi Sacks loved this nigun, composed by the Rebbe, the Lubavitch Rebbe. So I'll do Tzama Lecha Nafshi. But it's a bit of a home studio vibe. Tzama Lecha Nafshi Kama Lecha Besari Be'eretz Tzia Ve'ayef Li Amaya, בקודש חזי שיחה לירוי סוסך וכבודך כן בקודש חזי שיחה לירוי סוסך וכבודך כן בקודש חזי שיחה לירוי סוסך וכבודך Yama yama ma la 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 lo Yama yama ma Yama yama ma la 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 la
Choni, that was beautiful and soulful. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Sean, I believe we're going to play out with some images of Rabbi Sacks together with people around the world, and many of them with people in South Africa during his few visits. He came for Sinai and Darba. He came for Great Parks, I think 100th anniversary. He was a regular visitor to South Africa.
Yes. So once again, thank you to all our esteemed panelists, to Choni. That was amazing. It really was a special evening, and we appreciate your time. And we're here to pay tribute on behalf of the South African Jewish Report and the community to Rabbi Sacks. So thank you, everyone. And Danny, over to you.
if you would like to leave a tribute to Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, we will leave the comment section open for the next 10 minutes or so. Please feel free to leave a message in the chat section. Otherwise, we'll see you once again on Saturday evening. Thank you for joining us this evening.